Good evening, and thank you for inviting me to speak to you about my research. This thesis is due for submission at the end of March, but it is, of course, subject to edit, and the figures shown may change a little at submission due to minor corrections. So I'm going to move that over there so I can be friendly. Okay. Now, the title of the thesis, as Sally has said, is Social Mobility Through Marriage in London from 1743 to 1763. The aim of the research is to measure the social distance between couples marrying during this time in 3 London parishes, and to assess the impact of the Clandestine Marriages Act of 1753 on social mobility in marriage. Mingay, Davidov and others assert that the aristocracy was not a closed group, but this view is challenged by Kimberly Shutt's research on the daughters of the aristocracy, which indicates that if not completely closed, the door to social mobility through marriage was only slightly ajar. Studies on social mobility through marriage have focused on the elite, who are easier to identify and for whom information is more readily available. Both Mingay and Cooper point out that social mobility among the lower orders is difficult to measure and less well understood. This research provides a means by which this can be achieved to form a broader understanding of social mobility through marriage across the whole social spectrum. The conclusion is that the lower orders were highly socially mobile in their marriages. Over the 20-year period, 67.2% of marriages sampled from 3 London parishes were between brides and grooms with a different social status to each other. For 29.2% of them, the social distance between them was enough to change the lifestyle of one of them. This is despite condemnation of marriage to someone of a different social status in newspapers, magazines, essays, and even advertisements. Marriage notices and advertisements for marriage partners followed a pattern of comparing the occupational financial status of the man with the wealth brought to the marriage by the woman. Marriage between couples who were unequal in status or finance was unthinkable, at least in print. To investigate this, a database and 4 associated spreadsheets are used to assess the social status of brides and grooms from 1743 to 1763. Their social status is measured at the point of marriage in 3 London parishes. These are All Saints, Kingston upon Thames, St John Halsey Down in Bermondsey, and St Anne in Soho. The parishes have been selected for their character, proximity to London, and the quality of their records. The numbers of marriages and marriages by licence are also measured to determine the impact of the Clandestine Marriages Act of 1753 on the chosen parishes. The parishes in this study do demonstrate a considerable impact on the numbers of marriages and licences resulting from the Act. The Act does not appear to impact social mobility through marriage, but simply moves usual marriage practices from one location to another. The Clandestine Marriages Act of 1753 was intended to stop clandestine marriage, defined as any marriage which did not conform to the rules of the Church of England. For the first time, any marriage which did not take place in a Church of England chapel and in accordance with the Act was declared invalid. Statistics from the 3 parishes of this study suggest that clandestine marriage was not hiding social mobility in marriage, and that most couples who chose this method did so for reasons of privacy and speed. They used it as a cheap alternative to the marriage licence. Estimates for the percentage and numbers getting married clandestinely and in clandestine marriage centres vary wildly. According to Gillis, between 1/4 and 1/3 of marriages were clandestine. Stone says clandestine marriages account for between 15 and 20% of marriages by the mid-18th century. Probert points out that the availability of clandestine marriage varied depending on where the couple lived. It was far more available in London than anywhere else. She also notes that accounting for clandestine marriage must consider the many definitions used. Towns did not routinely count their populations at that time, so it is difficult to measure the rise in marriages due to population increase over the time, as opposed to couples being forced to marry in their local parish church. Any figures suggesting the number or percentage of clandestine marriages by the time of the Clandestine Marriages Act can only be educated guesses. After the Act, Probert suggests that people were mainly compliant. The fear of transportation for non-compliant clergy was enough to stop the trade completely. Religion played an important role in social status and social mobility through marriage. It could be either restrictive or liberating, and any parish with a large or well-recorded community of nonconformists could produce statistics which are impacted significantly by the practices of these groups. It is important to understand the attitudes towards social status and social mobility among religious groups and their representation in the community. Terms isogamy and anisogamy are used liberally throughout this paper, but they are rarely used in everyday life. Isogamy is marriage to someone of the same social status. Anisogamy is marriage to someone of a different social status. Isogamy or anisogamy are measured from the perspective of the groom. So when comparisons are made between different sections of society, it is the groom's social status which is used. For example, if a lower middling sort marriage is described as anisogamous, it is the man who is from the lower middling sort. The term exogamy is also used to describe marriage outside of a community or cohort or religion, and endogamy is marriage within that group. Most articles, essays, notices, and advertisements in newspapers and magazines were opposed to social mobility in marriage. These marriages were considered unequal and a cause of unhappiness in marriage. The author of a substantial piece in the Universal Spectator and Weekly Journal of 1745 is not named. It is titled Equilum tibi uxorum decito, which means take a wife who is equal to you. Using Latin or Greek was a device for telling readers that the article was grounded in an understanding of classical literature. The way in which women are mentioned signifies that the author is male. The entire article is dedicated to the concept of equality in marriage, and the author takes his authority and examples on the subject from Plutarch, Diogenes, Laertes, and Callimachus. Using ancient Greek or Latin sources was a method for giving weight to an argument and presented to the reader the idea that a good education naturally leads to these conclusions. In this way, the author has also given away their probable social status, because classical education at this time was usually reserved for the elites. The examples cited discuss mainly equality of fortune and rank between prospective husbands and wives. He argues that an unequal marriage will lead to inappropriate conduct on the part of the wife, and therefore to marital discord. The author implies that a woman's natural obligation to love and obey are distorted in an unequal marriage, causing her to step outside of her correct role. In relation to the behaviour of some men, he cites the following example. How many instances have we of very unhappy marriages in tradesmen's daughters who have been induced to marry noblemen for the sake of acquiring high titles, the noblemen marrying them only for the sake of their money, and consequently by disregarding their persons, using them afterwards according to the lowness of their birth, which they despise, forgetting the affluence of their fortunes, which they are still ungratefully enjoying. He blames the behaviour of the nobleman in this case for the failure of the marriage, but argues that new money should not be used to infiltrate the titled elites, because the husband and wife are unequal, and this leads to an unhappy marriage. The responsibility to change that behaviour is not discussed. Rather, the assumption is that this is the way human nature works, and controlling the circumstances is the correct way to control the behaviour. Put another way, it is not reasonable to place human beings in a situation where they are more likely to behave badly towards one another. In 1745, the same year, an advertisement appeared for a pamphlet called The Levellers. It reads as follows: The Levellers, a dialogue between two young ladies concerning matrimony, proposing an act for enforcing marriage, for the equality of matches, and taxing single persons, with danger of celibacy to a nation, dedicated to a member of Parliament. Of interest here is the inclusion of equality of matches. The writer is concerned enough to propose an act of Parliament to enforce equality between brides and grooms. The method used here is to dedicate the pamphlet to an unnamed member of Parliament. It is speculative in nature and is not targeted at any specific individual. The hope is that a member of Parliament will see the advertisement and take up the issue in government. Equilum tibi uxorum decito and the Levellers appeared in different publications in 1745, while the Clandestine Marriage Act was still being debated in Parliament. Both sought to influence the legislation and broaden it. Both are anonymous. While the Levellers is a paid advertisement, Equilum tibi uxorum decito is an article for which the editor has given space, or he has written it himself. It is likely that these ideas had support, at least from some members of the elite, given their prevalence. The views expressed were not new, and the Clandestine Marriages Act was discussed in Parliament for many years, as shown in an article by the Gentleman's Magazine in 1733 called Unsuitable Marriages. It says, as there is now under consideration a bill to prevent clandestine marriages, it would be very proper for somebody to endeavour to get some salutary clauses added to prevent unhappy marriages. When a lady marries her coachman or a gentleman his cookmaid, especially if there are children by former marriages, let them both be transported for 14 years. The writer goes on to propose penalties for unsuitable marriages, including differences in age, both unable to support themselves, both too old, marrying purely for money, marrying a rake, and marrying a prostitute. All of the penalties involve transportation. This article is satirical in nature, but the point still stands. Continuing on this theme, in 1741, Samuel Richardson published his letters written to and for particular friends. In his example letters, he sets out a clear opposition to marriage across social divides. Yet Pamela, an epistolary novel which he first published only 1 year earlier, centres on a poor servant girl who manages to reform and then marry her aristocratic master. Richardson's example letters are intended to be moral templates, advising courting couples and their friends and families. In them, he advises and commiserates on the unsuitable marriages of fictional persons, laying out what for him was the obvious difficulty. His fortune, madam, is not equal to yours. Pamela then becomes an exercise in mental gymnastics, as her virtue is pressed home repeatedly throughout his novel, explaining how her extreme social climbing was justified. His later letters concerning unequal marriage allow for no justification at all on the part of the woman. In his letters, however, he says a man cannot be blamed for trying to win the hand of a woman who is financially and socially superior. He does include a letter concerning the response of a woman of low fortune to a man of greater fortune who suggests to her that she be his mistress while he marries a woman of equal fortune to his own. Richardson's fictional epistolary response from the jilted woman is telling. Ungenerous man, to take advantage of your superior fortune to insult me thus when you had gained my affections. What though I am not blessed with a worldly circumstance equal to what you might expect in a wife, can you think my mind so base as to submit to be yours on unworthy terms? Go, unworthy man, and make your court to Miss Reynolds, as you seem to threaten. She has a fortune equal to your own, and maybe you'd be happy together. I should have been so had I never known you. I never deceived you. You knew my scanty fortune, and yet pretended to prefer me to all my sex. In this case, he takes the part of the offended woman, making it clear that she was honest about her circumstances from the beginning. This is closer to Pamela's situation and demonstrates that Richardson saw no contradiction in his writing. It seems her honesty and humility concerning her situation in life were enough to qualify her, in Richardson's opinion. Daniel Defoe, in his much earlier book, Conjugal Lewdness or Matrimonial Whoredom, 1727, also lists types of unacceptable inequalities in marriage and provides examples of how they can lead to the failure of marriages. His discussion on inequality of blood is similar in tone to Aquilum Tibiuxrum Decito. He also advises that equality of estate is crucial. This relates to the income and property of the groom and the wealth brought to the marriage by the bride. He says, these inequalities in some measure destroy the end of matrimony, and if they do not make it void, yet they rob the parties of the social comfort of a married life, and some indeed entirely destroy those comforts themselves. Interestingly, he discusses the case of a city baronet, where both parties had the same social status but different fortunes. He describes the wife as aggrieved that her fortune is in the hands of a man of lower fortune than herself, even though they hold the same social status. The case may well have mirrored his own lived experience. He married Mary Tuffley in 1684, who came to him with a huge dowry of £3,700. Defoe described himself as a merchant, and he may have seen himself as on an equal footing with Mary's father, who was also a merchant. But Defoe was in debt, and his wife's dowry may have been a deciding factor in his decision to marry. Despite the dowry, he was forced to declare himself bankrupt. For someone with such a tendency towards social mobility and who even took the opportunity in marriage when it presented itself, it is interesting that he wrote so vehemently on the consequences of unequal marriage. Defoe appears to be writing from experience, whilst also meeting the perceived preferences of his audience. I should mention that Defoe and Mary remained together for life despite their difficulties, and they had 8 children. The perception that unequal marriages were not desirable to the main readership was fed, at least in part, by marriage announcements and advertisements. The Gentleman's Magazine, set up in 1731 by Edward Cave, regularly advertised the marriages and settlements of the elite. This maintained the constant connection between marriage, social status, and finances in the minds of its readers. His publishing of marriage notices fell in line with the general format for marriage notices in newspapers. 2 newspaper examples Two newspaper examples are: on Sunday was married at Queen Street Chapel, Mr. Loft, a malt distiller in the borough, to Miss Probyn of Camberwell, a young lady with a fortune of £6,000. Yesterday was married at Battersea Church, Mr. Ludlow, who keeps Chelsea Ferry, to Mrs. Martin, who formerly kept the Smyrna Coffee House in Pall Mall, an agreeable widow with a considerable fortune. Every one of them gives the title or occupation of the groom and an indication of the fortune of the bride. The link between marriage and status for the groom and fortune for the bride seems inseparable. The link is maintained in advertisements by those seeking a marriage partner. The British Library houses a collection of newspaper extracts of matrimonial advertisements and related content. The collection also comprises a number of matrimonial advertisements selected from 18th century newspapers. One advertisement placed by a gentleman looking for a prospective wife and dated 1750 requests a lady who is possessed of an agreeable temper, with a moderate independent fortune, and is willing to pass her life upon honourable terms with a gentleman near 50 of a cheerful disposition and genteel profession. In common with marriage notifications, this extract includes the man's age and a hint at his fortune. This method was used by both men and women, and they used similar language. Most marriage advertisements discuss appearance or health, but this advertisement placed by a middle-aged man in the Public Ledger in 1769 is more focused on education. A gentleman between 40 and 50 years of age, a widower, would be glad to marry a person of his own age or older, provided she be good-tempered, sensible, and can sit by a genteel fireside and converse with gentlemen of understanding and a liberal education. Must have a fortune considerable, as he intends to keep her a carriage. A widow preferred before an old maid. His income is not inconsiderable and therefore demands the above fortune. It is not known if this advertisement was successful. But he appears to be comfortable with demanding a fortune from his prospective wife. These gentlemen did not seem to be concerned about how the advertisement might be perceived by others or excuse the method. In fact, the descriptions and requirements are listed in a straightforward manner. There was enough concern about marriage in the 18th century for organisations to develop which supported the concept of advertising for a spouse and those wishing to arrange their own marriages. The Imprejudicate Nuptial Society, or Grand Matrimonial Intercourse Institution, published their matrimonial plan sometime in the late 18th century. The Imprejudicate Nuptial Society claims to raise money for poor persons wishing to marry, with marriage expenses paid through the parishes. Of course, to the organisation, of concern to the organisation is the idea that people were choosing not to marry at all. Members of the society were divided into first, second, and third class according to status and wealth. Within the rules of the society is the right of first-class members to view the descriptions of those from the second and third classes. This is an unusual encouragement for marriage across social divides. Another innovation of this society is the proposal for women to make the first move, contrary to usual practice. This is not excused, but rather celebrated with the phrase, "Such advantages are too obvious to escape the public approbation." As the Society's matrimonial plan comments on rising bastardy levels, this reverse proposal could be justified to encourage marriage. The Society also claims to help men to avoid embarrassment. It says that in the common way, men first fall in love and then disgracefully retreat if there is not money enough. But here, the consequences are first known, and nothing to prevent sincere love afterwards. Lower class members could not see the advertisements by higher class members, again supporting the view that the higher classes could choose, but the lower classes were expected to marry at their own level unless chosen. The Matrimonial Society published their terms of reference at roughly the same time, although exact dates are not possible. The statement for the Matrimonial Society is aimed explicitly at the nobility and gentry, thus deliberately narrowing the social field. The aim is to provide a forum for men and women of that social level to meet and converse on different topics to ensure they find a spouse with whom they have interests in common. This fits the agenda of managed choice for the elites and their children. In condescension to those not among the elite, the statement says, friends among the lower orders may furnish information to the society in return for advice. In this statement, marital social engineering is explicit and unashamed. There are plenty of other sources, including manuals and letters from parents to their children and sermons concerning parental consent and love. The motivations for marriage is a huge subject, which cannot be covered in this paper, but it is clear that marriage across social divides was roundly condemned in print. It would not have been condemned, however, if it wasn't happening in the first place. The wealth of material seems reactionary. Writers like Richardson and Defoe were also adept at pleasing their readers, and it is impossible to know if their views were in line with what they wrote. They had a specific audience in mind, those who could afford to purchase their books and who were more likely to read the subject matter on offer. This rhetoric expressed the perceived views of the elite and fed their concerns about dilution and infiltration by the lower orders. Statistics from the three parishes at varying distance from the centre of London suggest that couples from broader social backgrounds had different views. To investigate the behaviour of couples from a wider social spectrum and the impact of the abolition of clandestine marriage, a database has been developed with 4 associated spreadsheets to calculate the social distance between brides and grooms. The database houses the data. The 4 spreadsheets perform all of the calculations. The first spreadsheet assesses rent payments. The second identifies the former spouse of widows and assigns a social code. The third spreadsheet aggregates the data to produce a social code for the brides and grooms. The final spreadsheet produces the results. The methodology for this study is a 4-stage process. First, find and record all of the marriages in the 3 parishes from 1743 to 1763 inclusive. Then find their parents. Thirdly, investigate the social status of the brides, grooms, parents, and former spouses of widows. Finally, measure the social distance between the bride and groom at the point of marriage. In order to measure social mobility, it is first necessary to measure social status, but this is the subject of some controversy. Both how to measure social status and what it meant in the early mid-18th century remain contentious topics. The classification of social status developed gradually throughout the 18th century and became consolidated and fine-tuned in the 19th century. At the beginning of the 18th century, the word class was not in general use, and there were varying ways to describe the social hierarchy. The question is often about how people saw themselves and how they were perceived by others. Gregory King and Joseph Massey, among others, developed classification systems based mainly on income. It is possible that the middling sort saw themselves in financial terms rather than any position conferred by birth. As Hunt says, rank is never purely a function of income, but it is seldom utterly divorced from it either. Caulfield and Shutt both agree, however, that the word rank implies a social position inherited at birth, which was not impacted by finances. Mingo uses Massey's statistics to demonstrate that some gentry and parish priests lived on relatively low incomes, while merchants, lawyers, and others could earn a very substantial amount of money without owning a title. Despite the disparity in income, the gentry still held a higher social status than members of the middling sort, who had considerably more money. This effectively divides the population into 2 sections, the aristocracy and the rest. Indeed, it was regularly described in this way until the size and strength of the middling section of society made it untenable. Hunt's point regarding a financial element still has merit when discussing anyone who was not an aristocrat. Especially a social position among the middling sort and the poor was heavily influenced by how much money or land they were known to possess or what their occupation was supposed to be worth. In that way, a tripartite classification falls short of describing the full social spectrum. To distinguish between different levels of status and wealth in the database, 18th century society is divided into 8 sections, and each is assigned a specific code. So paupers 1, poor unskilled 2, poor skilled 3, lower middling sort 4, comfortable middling sort 5, wealthy middling sort 6, gentry 7, aristocracy 8. It is acknowledged that people did not define themselves in this way, and the divide between one group and another could be fuzzy as people neared the line between one status and another, or indeed straddled it. This issue is discussed in detail in the thesis, but there isn't time for it here. Social difference is measured using the codes. A social difference of 1 is moving into the next group, either up or down. A social difference of more than 1 represents a significant change in lifestyle for one of the partners. The method involves subtracting the bride's social status from the groom's, giving a positive or negative figure indicating the social distance between the two. But how exactly is a person's social status defined? Establishing social status from financial records is often attempted by historians with a focus on one particular data set, such as Linda Hall's study of inventories and Schwartz and Jones's research of the Sun Fire Office records. Other approaches to researching social mobility include focusing on a specific family and tracking them over time, as in de Belague's investigation of a middle-class family in the 19th century and Dean Rapp's study of the Whitbread family. Debates also rage over the validity of using occupations to establish social status. Harvey et al. Argue that occupations do not necessarily reflect social status. Lindert gave the same warning, despite using occupations found in burial records. In this study, occupations are used in many cases because it is the most widely available information which could indicate social status. Clearly, that's not enough on its own, and I have already delivered a paper at the Life Cycle seminar on this subject. However, this research is opportunistic in nature, in that any and all records which contain evidence of social status, be that occupational, financial, or situational, add to the bank of evidence. This includes, but is not limited to, financial records, wills, rates, quarter sessions, parish registers, and nonconformist records. It even includes comments such as poor when they appear in documents. The database is housed in Microsoft Access with 4 Excel spreadsheets linked to it, as I've said. A wide variety of sources are used to provide evidence of social status, and the list of sources does not have to be limited. The database is designed for any type of source to be added. The social codes used are housed within a table, as are financial criteria and lists of occupations and titles. All this data can be changed and added to without difficulty, allowing a high level of flexibility for future research. Ultimately, the purpose of the database and spreadsheets is to measure the social distance between brides and grooms and assess levels of isogamy before and after the Clandestine Marriages Act. Only 32.8% of marriages sampled across the 3 parishes for the whole 20-year period were isogamous. This means most of these couples married over a social divide, even if it was a small one. The results are presented as a percentage of the total sample for each parish. For both Kingston upon Thames and St John Horsey Down in Bermondsey, there is very little difference in the isogamy levels after the Clandestine Marriage Act comes into force in 1754. In St Anne in Soho, however, there is a significant rise in isogamy, meaning that more marriages were between couples of the same social status after the Act. It is obviously important to understand the reasons for this, especially as St Anne was closer to the Fleet Prison and to St George's Private Chapel in Mayfair, and was hugely impacted when clandestine marriage was outlawed by the Act. At first, it appears that the marriages which would normally have taken place at clandestine centres were largely isogamous, but the situation is not that simple. Religion could influence marriage choices and attitudes towards social status. These are the same statistics, but the St John Horsey Down Quakers are treated as a separate cohort. Quaker marriages appear to become less isogamous over time, while the remaining marriages display a significant rise in isogamy, just as they do in St Anne, Soho. This supports the view that Quakers were egalitarian in their attitude towards social status, favouring marriage within the faith over marriage to a social equal. The number of Quaker marriages falls after the Act, and this may be a reason why their marriages become even more anisogamous. If the congregation shrinks, so too does the potential pool of marriage partners. With the Quakers removed from the St John Horsey Down sample, there are 2 parishes with a significant rise in isogamy after the Act. This does indeed suggest that clandestine marriages were largely isogamous. However, what constitutes a social difference of only 1 on the social scale may not have been seen as important by contemporaries, even though it does demonstrate some social mobility. The range over which a marriage was considered equal may have been wider for them. To look at this further, marriage over a social distance of more than 1 is also measured. This constitutes a significant difference for the bride or groom in their standard of living and would have been recognised as unequal. In this slide, where anisogamy is identified as marriage with a social difference of more than 1, the fall in anisogamy in Kingston is precipitous. In St John Horsey Down and St Anne, anisogamy rises very slightly. The Quakers, however, continue to demonstrate their egalitarian ethos with much higher anisogamy rates that rise significantly over time. So why did anisogamy fall so sharply in Kingston while rising slightly in the other 2 parishes? The answer lies in the changing character of the town and which section of society was producing the most unequal marriages. People from every section of society married across the wide social divides, but proportionately, the middling sort were the largest contributors. They made up only 25% of the population, but were responsible for most of the unequal marriages in these 3 parishes, as represented by levels 4 to 6. Coming in at a close second is the poor at levels 1 to 3. By poor, I do not mean paupers necessarily. Level 3 were the skilled poor who earned enough to keep going, and this could include lower level artisans like cordwainers or butchers and bricklayers. Marriages across a social distance of more than 1 often took place between this section of society and the middling sort. They regularly crossed this line throughout their lives and at the point of marriage, but just under a third of all the marriages in the sample across all 3 parishes were across a social divide of more than 1. So why was Kingston different to the other two parishes? In this parish, the sample for the period before the Act contained a higher proportion of middling sorts than the general population. There are other important factors involved, and they are not all related to the Clandestine Marriages Act. Parishes were impacted in accordance with their distance from the main clandestine centres. Walking distance is used to illustrate the distances between the parishes and clandestine centres. Although couples could travel by cart or carriage, walking distance allows for a reasonable comparison. Kingston upon Thames is a 4.5-hour walk from the Fleet prison and just over 4 hours from St George's Chapel in Mayfair. For the residents of the town, clandestine marriage would have been a deliberate choice and not just a convenient alternative. Kingston is further from London, but the numbers of marriages still rose significantly after the Act. Of consideration is the general rise in the population of London and the surrounding areas throughout the 18th century. The St John Horsley Down Chapel was destroyed by a World War II bomb, and the site is now home to the London City Mission, so I had to measure from there. The St George's Mayfair Chapel is a walking distance of 1.25 hours from this location. It takes 40 minutes to walk to the Fleet. Not only is Bermondsey just south of the River Thames and therefore close to the most popular centres offering clandestine marriage in London, but its population was dominated by artisans and the skilled trades for whom clandestine marriage was popular. In St Anne in Soho falls directly between the Fleet prison, a half-hour walk, and St George's Chapel in Mayfair, which involves a 15-minute walk. Comparing the cost of a wedding at St Anne's to the cost of a Fleet wedding could leave St Anne's vulnerable to a leaching of its parishioners into the clandestine marriage trade. This can be seen clearly in the parish records, with some months recording no marriages at all before the Act came into force. After the Act, the numbers of marriages explodes. St Anne's was also affected by the rising population of London at this time, so this also has to be taken into consideration. The number of marriages rose dramatically in all three parishes from the mid-18th century onwards. The rise in marriage is an indicator of the rising population. However, the closer a parish was to the clandestine marriage centres in London, the more the rise in marriages was linked to the outlawing of clandestine marriage. Those who would originally have chosen to marry clandestinely were now forced, if they wanted a legal marriage, to marry in a Church of England church. Before the Act, those parishes closest to the clandestine centres in London were particularly vulnerable to losing their parishioners to this trade. It is therefore reasonable to assume that the numbers of marriages in those parishes would rise significantly after the Act came into force. Bishop Richard Terrick, 1710 to 1777, carried out a survey which demonstrated a 61% recovery across 27 London parishes after the Act. Jill Newton's Campop study of Clerkenwell also reveals a dramatic rise in marriages in the parishes of Clerkenwell immediately after the Act. The chart shows the number of marriages in these three parishes for every year from 1743 to 1763. Kingston upon Thames is a smaller parish, and the numbers generally are much lower, but the number of marriages more than doubles after the Act. For 1751 and 1752, there are only 7 marriages in each year. In 1753, there are only 4. These figures are lower than for previous years, indicating that some parishioners were making the most of what remained of the Act, of clandestine marriage before the Act, and choosing clandestine marriage while it was still available. In the 3 years after the Act, 13, 22, and 20 marriages are performed. From that point forward, the numbers continue to rise. The Act had an immediate impact on the numbers marrying at All Saints, Kingston upon Thames, but the continued rise is due to population growth. In St John Horsley Down in Bermondsey, the numbers of marriages in the parish remains fairly steady until 1756, when the number of marriages peaks to 71. There is no sudden rise in 1754 when the Act came into force, but the number of marriages continues to climb significantly from 1755 onwards. This parish had a strong artisan population. This is the cohort identified by Uthwaite and Jacob Field as being strongly represented in the Fleet registers. It is likely that 1754 was a normal year because those who wanted to marry clandestinely did so before the Act came into force. Bermondsey grew significantly over the 18th century, so much of the rise in numbers came from the increase in population. However, the dramatic difference between the years before and after the Act indicate that at least part of this rise is due to the cessation of clandestine marriage. For the parish of St Anne in Soho, the difference is much clearer. Just as in St John Horsley Down, St Anne experiences a decline in marriages from 1747 to 1751. It is much closer to the Fleet and Mayfair and was impacted by the increasing popularity of these centres. Marriages began to rise in 1752 and 53 as the population of the parish increased, but from 1754 onwards, there is a huge growth in the number of marriages, which rises significantly and reaches triple figures from 1758 onwards. St Anne was impacted both by the Act and the growth of London as a whole. The numbers are not higher due to a higher proportion of elite families in the area who only rarely resorted to clandestine marriage. What this shows is that the middling sort and poorer members of the parish often chose clandestine marriage when it was available, leaving them invisible in the marriage record until the Act forced them to marry in their own parish church. The last year of this study is 1763, and for all three parishes, there is a sudden dramatic rise in the number of marriages that year. The reason for this is not yet known. The rise in 1763 could be attributed to better record keeping as well as population growth. As this is the last year of this study, it is not known if the trend continued or if this year was anomalous. The proportion of licenses to the total number of marriages for all three parishes begins in 1743 at 38%, which is very high. This high figure could be due to better recording of marriages by licence, but it also reflects the character of the wealthier London parishes where marriage by licence was more common. A simple comparison between marriages by licence as a percentage of those marrying in the parish before and after the Act came into force answers the question about the rise in numbers of licences resulting from the Act. For the parishes of this study, the results reflect their size and the distance from the centre of London. The number of couples marrying by licence in Kingston upon Thames is extremely variable. This is partly due, putting it mildly, this is partly due to the small size of the parish compared to the other larger London parishes. Small sample sizes are subject to greater variation. But another possible explanation is that licences were expensive and used mainly by wealthy parishioners. As the wealthy constituted a smaller section of an already small population, their marriages happened less frequently, resulting in the peaks and troughs shown in the chart. Nevertheless, the proportion of parishioners marrying by licence declines over time. There is a particularly low slump in 1752 and 53, which are the 2 years directly preceding the Act. The decline of marriage by licence in Kingston is explained by the changing character of the town, which will be discussed later. The parishes of St John, Horsley Down and St Anne's, Soho are much larger and their marriage licences follow a different pattern. St John, Horsley Down also experiences a slump in 1751, but this recovers the following year. Although this could be due to an increase in clandestine marriages that year, it is also possible, given the fast recovery, that the information in the parish register is just not as complete for that year. Fewer marriages in total are recorded for 1751. Many marriage entries provide no information regarding bans or licenses, and not all marriage licence allegations survive. Many that do are damaged. Nevertheless, for this parish, the licenses rise markedly from 1754 to 57, where they peak. However, they fall again and oscillate thereafter because licenses were expensive, and it is natural for people to reconcile with a new normal and get used to the new rules. Couples marrying for the first time in a few years after the Act did not have the experience of a clandestine alternative in the capital. After the Act, the proportions of marriage licences to the total number of marriages rises significantly in St Anne's, suggesting that Bolton is right about the primary motive for clandestine marriage as a cheap replacement for a marriage licence. Even Bolton notes, however, that this seems to apply only to London and indicates that the phenomenon is driven by a fashion for speed and privacy led by the elites. St Anne is particularly vulnerable to the clandestine marriage trade and follows the pattern observed by Terrick and Newton in the other London parishes close to the clandestine centres. The number of licences for the three parishes does indeed rise in line with the rise in marriages, but this is the percentage of licences to total marriages, and a rise in the proportion of licences is clearly evident after the Act. This then reduces slightly and appears more stable going forward. One way of assessing the possible impact of the Clandestine Marriage Act is comparing the social status of the sample for the 10 years before the Act. However, there are challenges with this approach. 343 marriages in Kingston upon Thames were collected for the years 1743 to 1763. This is all of the marriages recorded in the parish register and some non-conformist records, including a small number of Quakers. 44 of these marriages made it into the sample. That's small. That means that there was enough evidence to establish the social status of both the bride and the groom for 44 of the marriages. Small sample sizes are vulnerable to changes in the quality of the records, as well as population increase and changes in the law. The balance of social status changes significantly from one period to the next, but this does not appear to be due to the Act. It is likely that there is more evidence for the poor from the mid-18th century onwards, and this is when more poor couples made it into the sample. Kingston was also subject to a general gravitation towards towns, especially towns near London. The middling sort marrying in Kingston appears to decline, but it declines to fall more in line with national levels. It is therefore another indicator of the amount of evidence available for different levels of society over time. The records for Kingston before 1754 clearly favour the middling sort. The sample size is much larger for St John Horsley Down, making the numbers more reliable and more representative. Of the 844 marriages collected, 141 made it into the sample. There are no elite marriages. This does not mean there were no elites living in St John Horsley Down, but simply that they chose not to marry there. Although the number of sample marriages among the poor falls a little, their proportion rises. The sample of middling sort marriages falls after the Act. This may be that people moved into more desirable areas as they became more successful. It would appear that St John Horsley Down attracted poor migrants and those who might previously have married at clandestine centres. But as the numbers of poor residents rose, the area became less attractive to the middling sort. Some of the trades carried out in Bermondsey were particularly smelly, including leatherwork and glue making, which would make the area unattractive to those not in these trades who had the financial means to live elsewhere. The sample size for St Anne in Soho is smaller than St John Horsley Down, but larger than Kingston. Although 1,597 marriages were collected, only 65 made it into the sample. This is due largely to lower levels of detail in the parish registers. These figures are, of course, subject to change, and this study is ongoing. The changes in the parish between the periods before and after the Act are dramatic. They reflect the growing population of the area and the movement of marriages into the parish, which might previously have been carried out clandestinely. The character of the parish appears to change, but it is specifically the marriages which change. The dramatic rise in marriages among the poor of the parish is clear evidence of the move away from clandestine marriages and the proximity of St Anne's to the two main clandestine centres. The middling sort marriages fall to the national level, just as they do in Kingston, and probably for the same reason. Elite marriages fall in proportion, but not in number, and this is again reflective of the evidence available. They appear in the same numbers before and after the Act, indicating that they have the same amount of evidence associated with them. The behaviour of some religious communities and the quality of their records can disproportionately impact statistics on social mobility and marriage. Conversely, communities such as Quakers and Jews can also act as a constant during a significant period of change because they were exempt from some parts of the Act. Seeing the danger to their own religious practices, the Quakers and Jews appealed early on in the process for consideration and were rewarded with total exemption from the part of the Act which insisted on marriage in a Church of England church with Church of England clergy. The Catholics were called napping. Other sections of the Act from which they were not exempt fell within the standards which Quakers already held. These included the age at marriage and the consent of parents under the age of 21. At a time when the rules for marriage were changing and people's behaviour along with it, Quakers acted as a constant against which other communities could be measured. Religions which focus on marriage within their own communities have the capacity to distort the statistics on social mobility through marriage, especially if marriage within the community is more important than social status. However, these religious communities were small in number, and the distortion is only evident at a local level. So care must be taken with the statistics for St John Horsley Down, because there was a strong Quaker community in that area and they were effective record keepers. This means their representation in the record could be disproportionate. If, for example, the Quakers had higher rates of anisogamy, the whole of St John Horsley Down would appear to be more anisogamous due to a disproportionately high number of Quakers whose marriages qualify for inclusion in the sample. For this parish, it is necessary to treat the Quakers separately from the rest of the parish to gain a more accurate picture of the general population. Exogamy could be caused by persecution or the fear of it, as well as the social disadvantages experienced by those from non-conformist religions. Sephardic Jews often married outside of their own religion for the social advantages it offered them and their children. In Ireland, Catholics were actively persecuted, and one of the ways to avoid this outcome was to outwardly convert to Protestantism or marry a Protestant. This study does not measure exogamy because it does not necessarily affect social status. In most nonconformist religions, members were still concerned with social status and it still had a bearing on their marriages. Certain religions seem to favour the same occupations. This is important because occupation was often equated with social status. The St John Horsley Down Quakers included many who described themselves as merchants, including the Warner and Hagan families, who were very successful and wealthy. Lutherans were well represented in the sugar baking industry in London, although the community as a whole held positions across the social spectrum, and many married out of the faith. In Ireland, the sugar baking industry was dominated by Catholics. Ashkenazi Jews were regularly recognised as peddlers through their distinct appearance. Sephardic Jews, on the other hand, were known to appear and dress in accordance with the fashions of the day. They did not stand out. They were generally wealthier than Ashkenazi Jews and had strong associations with banking and finance. Moravians in England and Germany lived in the community, but their lives were dominated by their religion, and they could even be asked to relocate to another country. In America, they lived communally, so were entirely dependent on mutual support. So to some degree, religion could dictate social status. People from nonconformist religions were sometimes disadvantaged by the law. By the early 18th century, Sephardic and Ashkenazi Jews were legally settling in England. Catholics were distrusted but tolerated, and the 1688 Toleration Act protected most nonconformists from persecution on condition that they made an oath of loyalty. Its true purpose was to unite Protestants of all persuasions against the Catholic James II. However, a change of monarch soon led to other ways in which to persecute nonconformists, as illustrated by Daniel Defoe's incarceration for his pamphlet, The Shortest Way with the Dissenters, in 1702. This print is a 19th century image of Daniel Defoe in the pillory, which happened to him 3 times, all on account of the nonconformist views he dared to put into print. The debate from 1702 to 1719 concerned occasional conformity, which was the only method by which a nonconformist could hold public office. This involved nonconformists taking communion in a Church of England church, usually very publicly, at least once a year. The insistence on conformity for public office restricted social status among nonconformists who could not occasionally conform and limited their opportunities. However, religious tolerance prevailed in the courts, as religious communities were often judged according to their own laws rather than common law when disputes arose in their congregations or in their marriages. Specific religions could shape the social status of their adherents. Small religious communities could be endogamous in nature in order to preserve their numbers, which naturally leads to anisogamy. This is particularly true among Quakers, but the social status of the group may have a mean average, which leads the community to marry within a small social range, making the marriages within the community isogamous, but not deliberately so. Being a member of a specific religious community linked an individual to all others nationally who shared that identity regardless of their location. In the case of Quakers and Moravians, this identity was more important than location or social status. There is a lot more which could be said about nonconformist religions and their impact on social mobility through marriage. Most importantly, however, their views concerning social status must be considered if they represent a significant section of a studied population. In conclusion, newspapers, magazines, and essays were widely unfavourable to unequal marriage. Marriage advertisements reinforced the connection between social status, finance, and choice of marriage partner. Even in the exceptional case of the imprejudicate nuptial society, members were divided into classes according to status and financial expectations. However, the articles were either written by the elites themselves or they were written with that audience in mind, and they did not necessarily reflect the views of the general population. Their prevalence suggests that unequal marriage was common and was a problem which the elites felt needed to be addressed. The 3 parishes of this study confirm that 67.2% of sampled marriages in these parishes were anisogamous, at least by some degree. A significant minority of 29.2% were across a larger social divide. The figures were produced by combining different types of sources for brides and grooms from 3 London parishes from 1743 to 63, and by assigning social codes to them when their social status was identified. The sample was produced from marriages where the social status of both the bride and groom were identified and the social distance between them could be measured. The 3 parishes were impacted by the Clandestine Marriages Act, as indicated by the numbers of marriages and licenses, but the further the parishes from London, the weaker the impact. Population growth, the Act, and religion all affected the statistics. Religion impacted social mobility through marriage and could distort figures at a local level. If clandestine marriage was hiding social mobility in marriage, then social mobility in marriage should have risen after the Act, because these marriages could no longer be carried out secretly. Even if the Act effectively prevented some of these marriages, there should still be a difference of some sort. There isn't. The rise in marriage licenses in the 3 parishes immediately after the Act suggests that clandestine marriage was being used as a cheap alternative to a marriage license. The marriages in the samples extracted from Kingston upon Thames, St John, Horsley Down, Bermondsey, and St Anne's, Soho suggest that clandestine marriages fell in line with marriages elsewhere and were usually entered into for reasons of privacy and speed rather than secrecy. Anisogamy was so common, clandestine marriage was used only occasionally to overcome a social divide. Thank you.